Sounds True presents The Secrets of the Immortal, Session 6 with Gary Renard.
I'd like to talk about the subject of time as it's thought of in A Course in Miracles because it's a fascinating subject. And not only that, but the Course itself says that at some point it's necessary for the teacher of God to understand the concept of time. Now, that's not to say that it's easy. It's a little complicated. It's very esoteric. And yet at the same time, it's kind of artistic and fun to think about and fun to play with. There are a lot of paradoxes in A Course in Miracles. And there are paradoxes when it comes to the subject of time, not the least of which is that it's already determined. And yet at the same time, it doesn't do us any good to just hang around saying it doesn't matter. In fact, A Course in Miracles asks us to take kind of like a proactive way of forgiveness about us and actually do this. And it says that we have work to do, and that we have to do it. And if we don't do it, then we're not going to get home. We're just going to stay stuck in illusion. So that's a paradox. If it's already determined, then people will ask, well, what does it matter what I do? And the answer that I give is that if you don't practice forgiveness, then you'll just appear to stay stuck here forever. So that alone is a good enough reason to do this. I'm going to start with a couple of readings from workbook lesson number 158, which is called Today I Learned to Give as I Receive, because there's a lot in this particular workbook lesson about the subject of time, and I'll read a couple of things and I'll talk about them afterwards. It says here, what has been given you? The knowledge that you are a mind, in mind, and purely mind, sinless forever, wholly unafraid, because you were created out of love. Nor have you left your source, remaining as you were created. A Course in Miracles will think of us as being mind. It doesn't use the word soul because for most people the word soul is a separation idea. They think of it as being them separate from others, so like you have a separate soul. But that would not be spirit under the definition of A Course in Miracles because spirit under the Course is pure and whole and perfectly one, so there would be no division. So what most people think of as an individual soul is actually a seemingly separated mind. And this quotation says, what has been given you the knowledge that you are a mind, small m, in mind with a large M, so that would be spirit, and purely mind. And that's why it says after that, sinless forever, wholly unafraid, because you were created out of love. So we're using the mind to relearn what we really are, which is spirit. And anything else that appears to be separate, the body or a seemingly separated soul, those are just separation ideas. And they don't really have anything to do with what we're choosing, which is to be perfectly one with everything. And it says, nor have you left your source, remaining as you were created. I love that saying that you find throughout the workbook. I am not a body, I am free, for I am still as God created me. And we see many of the ideas repeated in different ways, reinforced. They all fit together. Here it says, nor have you left your source, remaining as you were created. And elsewhere the Course says, the full awareness of the atonement is that the separation never occurred. Then the Course goes on to say, this was given you as knowledge which you cannot lose. It was given as well to every living thing, for by that knowledge only does it live. So somewhere in everybody's mind they know this. It's still there. It was given to us in creation, as we were one with God, and it's still there in the mind for our remembering. And that lesson then goes on to say, you have received all this. No one who walks the world but has received it. It is not this knowledge which you give, for that is what creation gave. All this cannot be learned. What then are you to learn to give today? Experience cannot be shared directly in the way that vision can. The revelation that the Father and the Son are one will come in time to every mind. Yet is that time determined by the mind itself, not taught. So here we start to get the idea that revelation, which is the actual experience of being with God, the actual experience of what you really are and what it's like to be that, where you actually get to experience what it's going to be like all the time when we return to heaven. That experience and when it's going to happen has already been determined by the mind itself. So it goes on here to say, the time is set already. It appears to be quite arbitrary. Yet there is no step along the road that anyone takes but by chance. It has already been taken by him, although he is not yet embarked on it. For time but seems to go in one direction. We but undertake a journey that is over. Yet it seems to have a future still unknown to us. It's a very interesting statement. It says time but appears to go in one direction. And usually when you're reading the Course, you see the word but, you can just substitute the word only if it helps you to understand it. Time only seems to go in one direction. And the truth is, it doesn't, because it's an illusion. And that's why the Holy Spirit was able to look back from the end of time and see everything that had already happened. It goes on here to say, time is a trick, a sleight of hand, a vast illusion in which figures come and go as if by magic. Yet there is a plan behind appearances that does not change. The script is written. That's a very famous line from A Course in Miracles. The script is written. It's already determined. When experience will come to end your doubting has been set. For we but see the journey from the point at which it ended, looking back on it, imagining we make it once again, reviewing mentally what has gone by. We're watching a film that's already been made, and it's already happened, and we're reviewing it mentally, like we're watching the same tape over and over again. And what gets us out of that is the forgiveness that then leads to this experience of revelation and leads to the end. You may or may not experience that revelation in this lifetime. The Course doesn't explain why it happens to some people and not others, but I think the answer is that because the mind is holographic, then when each person awakens, it's actually symbolic of the larger mind awakening. So there's only one mind that's awakening, and that it appears to happen gradually in a linear time frame. And so, we have some people who appear to wake up before others. So the Holy Spirit looked back from the end of time and decided when it would be the best time for everybody to wake up. So it looked over at this person and said, okay, well, that's a good time for you to wake up because you have enough time to study this stuff and you have the right relationships to forgive. So this is a good time for you to wake up. It looks at somebody else and the Holy Spirit says, well, 6 years from now, maybe that's a good time for you to wake up. And maybe it looks at me and it says, well, it'd be helpful for you to come back and practice forgiveness because maybe you'll act as an example for other people. And we have this, interlocking chain of forgiveness that the Course talks about. And maybe if I come back, then that'll be good for everybody. And the Holy Spirit always does what's best for everybody, not just for one of us or two of us, but for everyone involved. And so the Holy Spirit has actually seen everything that ever happened, determined when it was best for you to awaken, and then that plays itself out. And then you start to have the experiences when the time comes that tells you that you're awakening. But it was actually already decided ahead of time, and you knew before you even came here in this lifetime that this was going to be the one where you really started to wake up and maybe even completely woke up, because as Arden and Persis say at the end of The Disappearance of the Universe, there are more enlightened people now on the planet than there have ever been, and that trend will continue. And a lot of it is because of A Course in Miracles and books like The Disappearance of the Universe and all the other things that are out there that are helping people to awaken. So the Course then goes on to say, a teacher does not give experience because he did not learn it. It revealed itself to him at its appointed time. But vision is the gift. That's pretty wild. So it just revealed itself to you at its appointed time. And it was already going to happen. And it goes on to say, Christ's vision has one law. It does not look upon a body and mistake it for the Son whom God created. So if we can just get that people are not bodies and that what they really are is perfect spirit, just as God created them, then that is how we will come to see ourselves. It says, it beholds, and by it means vision, beholds a light beyond the body, an idea beyond what can be touched, a purity undimmed by errors, pitiful mistakes, and fearful thoughts of guilt from dreams of sin. It sees no separation, and it looks on everyone, on every circumstance, all happenings, and all events, without the slightest fading of the light it sees. This can be taught, and must be taught, by all who would achieve it. It requires but the recognition that the world cannot give anything that faintly can compare with this in value, nor set up a goal that does not merely disappear when this has been perceived. And this you give today. See no one as a body. Greet him as the Son of God he is, acknowledging that he is one with you in holiness. Later on it says, it matters not when revelation comes, for that is not of time. Yet time has still one gift to give, in which true knowledge is reflected in a way so accurate its image shares its unseen holiness. Its likeness shines with its immortal love. We practice seeing with the eyes of Christ today. And by the holy gifts we give, Christ's vision looks upon ourselves as well. So, that's the secret of the immortal. Its likeness shines with its immortal love. We practice seeing with the eyes of Christ today. It's true perception that will get us out of here. It's seeing with the eyes of Christ. It's a spiritual attitude. It's seeing everybody the way that they really are. If you see everybody like that, and remember them as being that, and think of them as being that way, instead of judging and condemning them, then you cannot help but awaken to your immortality. It has to happen. It's like the laws of the mind. It's all about how you see other people. And that's why the Course made that famous statement, which I'll repeat once more, as you see him, you will see yourself. That is something that very few people in the history of the world have ever understood, that what will determine your enlightenment, what will determine your experience, how you feel about yourself, even what you identify yourself to be, it's really determined by how you look at other people and see them. And that's a great secret that a lot of people haven't known, and there are even people who read A Course in Miracles who don't seem to really grasp the importance of that it's all about how you look at and think about other people, and that is the fastest ticket home. That is the way out of here. If you change the way that you think about others, it has to lead to enlightenment. It has to undo that unconscious guilt that is in the mind, and that is the one thing that is keeping us here. That is the one thing that is really preventing us from breaking the cycle of birth and death. So these are very important concepts from the Course. And I'm going to switch to another workbook lesson, which is a little while after that, that also deals with the subject of time. And that's workbook lesson number 169, which says, by grace I live, by grace I am released. This covers a very important idea about what Artin and Persa described as the absolute truth in A Course in Miracles. Some people may shy away from that idea of the absolute truth, but I really think that this is the absolute truth. Listen to this. Oneness is simply the idea God is, and in his being he encompasses all things. No mind holds anything but him. We say God is, and then we cease to speak. For in that knowledge words are meaningless. There are no lips to speak them, and no part of mind sufficiently distinct to feel that it is now aware of something not itself. It has united with its source, and like its source itself, it merely is. So that idea that God is, that is the absolute truth. That's all that exists. At one point my teacher said, 2,000 years from now, God will still be the absolute truth, and God will still be perfect love 2,000 years from now. The real truth doesn't change. Yes, it may take different forms, and it may have different appearances, but the ultimate truth does not change. That's why it's not relative. It's not changing, and it's not obscure. Only God is real. The Vedanta is right. I think A Course in Miracles is right, and that's the truth. And everything else is false. The truth is true, and nothing else is true. And what's true is God and the perfect oneness with him. and everything else is just separation and illusion, and something that needs to be awakened from so that we can awaken to where we really are and where, in fact, we never really left. Talking about this, the Course goes on to say, the atonement, it returns the mind into the endless present, where the past and future cannot be conceived. I think that's a really neat concept, the endless present, because that's an experience that takes place outside of time. There is no past, there is no future, there is no now as we traditionally think about it. It's the endless present. At one other point in the Course calls it the eternal always. So that's a little different take on reality, which is one with God, and it doesn't have, again, anything to do with consciousness or evolution or any of that stuff. It's completely outside of that whole ecosystem, and instead right there in the endless present. And I think that's really cool. And once you have that experience of revelation, it's like you really see what that means, because it's an experience that is constant. So it's not like you're waiting for something else to happen. It's right there, and you're just in that experience, and there is nothing else. There's this famous drawing of this Zen Buddhist teacher teaching another student, and he ties the student up. He puts a gag on him, and the guy can't even move. And then the teacher says to the guy, he says, "This is it. Nothing happens next." And it's like he's just there, and the guy's trying to figure out what to make of this. And I think what the teacher is saying is that if you were having the experience of your source, it wouldn't matter, because nothing happens next. It's just that great feeling of being in this present, endless present, with God, and it's such a marvelous experience. It doesn't matter that nothing's going to happen next. In fact, you don't want anything to happen next. You don't need anything to happen next. And that whole idea of something happening next is a time-based thing that leads to all kinds of problems that we really don't need. It also says here, this is beyond experience we try to hasten. Yet forgiveness, taught and learned, brings with it the experiences which bear witness that the time the mind itself, determined to abandon all but this, is now at hand. So I think the moral of that is if you're doing it, then you're doing it. And you wouldn't be doing it if it wasn't the right time for you to be doing it. Some very interesting statements about time are made here. And when it says the word his here, by the way, it's talking about the Holy Spirit. All learning was already in his mind, accomplished and complete. He recognized all that time holds, and gave it to all minds, that each one might determine from a point where time was ended, when it is released to revelation and eternity. We have repeated several times before that you but make a journey that is done. For oneness must be here. Whatever time the mind has set for revelation is entirely irrelevant to what must be a constant state, forever as it always was, forever to remain as it is now. We merely take the part assigned long since, and fully recognized as perfectly fulfilled by Him who wrote salvation's script in His Creator's name, and in the name of His Creator's Son. Then the Course goes on to say, there is no need to further clarify what no one in the world can understand. Sometimes when Jesus says something like that, you just want to strangle him. There is no need to further clarify what no one in the world can understand. When revelation of your oneness comes, it will be known and fully understood. Now we have work to do. For those in time can speak of things beyond, and listen to words which explain what is to come is past already. Yet what meaning can the words convey to those who count the hours still, and rise and work and go to sleep by them? Suffice it then that you have work to do to play your part. The ending must remain obscure to you until your part is done. It does not matter, for your part is still what all the rest depends on. As you take the role assigned to you, salvation comes a little nearer each uncertain heart that does not beat as yet in tune with God. Then it says, forgiveness is the central theme that runs throughout salvation, holding all parts in meaningful relationships, the course it runs directed, and its outcome sure. So there's a couple of big statements there. First of all, about forgiveness. Also about time itself. For your part is still what all the rest depends upon. Think about that. It would be impossible for the world to be saved without you playing your part. It's like all the rest depends on you playing your part. You could ask the question, can the world be saved without you? And the answer is no, of course not. At one point, there's a paradox there, too, because the Course is saying that the Holy Spirit can see everything, so his part is really very big, and yours is small. But paradoxically, the world can still not be saved without you. It's still absolutely essential that you play your part in order for everybody to awaken. Another big statement there is about forgiveness and how important it is to this whole thing. It really is the most important part because it says here, forgiveness is the central theme that runs throughout salvation. Holding all its parts in meaningful relationships, the course it runs directed, and its outcome sure. So, forgiveness is really where it's at. That's what makes the whole thing happen, and that's what leads to the end. There's some very interesting and advanced things that are said right at the beginning of the Course in Miracles, right in those first 50 Miracles Principles and in the first section. And it's really interesting. And Jesus tells us all these things at the beginning of the Course. He starts off by saying there is no order of difficulty in miracles. One is not harder or bigger than another. They are all the same. And he's talking to us, like we know what he's talking about. And of course, he knows that we don't know what he's talking about. And when you first start reading A Course in Miracles, it's like it might as well be written in a foreign language or something. And what happens is the ideas in the Course are introduced and then dropped and then they're reintroduced, and you start seeing the same things showing up in different ways over and over and over again, and that's how you start to understand them. And as things get repeated, you start to catch on. And then maybe someday, a year later, 2 years later, you go back and you read another paragraph, and it's like, wow, I never saw that before or never understood it like that, because you're starting to get it, and as you start to get it and actually apply forgiveness, then the ego is being undone. And as the ego is being undone, you look at these paragraphs in the Course, and you're seeing them from a different place. The words haven't changed, but you've changed. It's like you're seeing them differently now because your ego is being undone. And when that happens, then you see everything differently. One of the statements I like very early in those first 50 Miracles Principles, number 19, it says, miracles make minds one in God. I really love that thought, the fact that when we forgive someone and we're joining with someone by releasing them and seeing what they really are, and we become one with them, it's like miracles are making minds, all minds, one in God. And so there is no separation. It's like everything is one and everything is whole and complete. Another important statement here, it says, you are a miracle, capable of creating in the likeness of your Creator. Everything else is your own nightmare and does not exist. So once again, you see that perfect non-dualism, pure non-dualism as expressed in A Course in Miracles. You are a miracle capable of creating in the likeness of your Creator. You're the same as God. And then it says everything else is your own nightmare and does not exist. So there you see that uncompromising choice that the Course is asking us once again. Everything else does not exist. It's just a nightmare. It's just a dream. And eventually it gets replaced as we practice forgiveness by a happier and gentler dream, because we're not so frightened by the world anymore. These things that used to scare us in the world, they become like, I don't know if you remember, they used to have these jack-in-the-boxes that would kind of like pop out and scare children. Well, the things that scare us in this world, they kind of become like a jack-in-the-box, because now they try to scare us again, but we're coming from a different place and we can see that it's not real, and so it doesn't scare us anymore. And so it's not that the world is changing, it's not that on the level of form it's doing anything different. It's that we're looking at it different, and so it doesn't scare us anymore. And that's why it's a happier dream. That's why the Course calls the end of this whole thing the happy dream, because now, it's not that the world has changed, and we followed the Course axioms, seek not to change the world, seek rather to change your mind about the world. And so you don't have to change the world. You just, through looking at it differently, understanding that there's nothing here to be afraid of. And that's why it's a happier dream, because that fear isn't there anymore. It says here, atonement works all the time and in all the dimensions of time. Now, that's a very interesting statement for a spiritual document to be making, that atonement, which is this whole process of correction that leads to all of us going home again, that it works in all the dimensions of time, because it's telling us that this isn't the only dimension of time. This isn't all there is. There are other dimensions going on simultaneously. There's a very interesting phenomenon in A Course in Miracles that talks about how the Holy Spirit collapses time. And the way my teachers explained it to me once in The Disappearance of the Universe was at a time when I was complaining to them about when I went to the movies, and I had two movies to choose from that were starting at roughly the same time. And I chose a movie, and I went to it for 2 hours, and it really wasn't very good. It was kind of bad. And then a couple of weeks later, I was bitching and moaning to Art and Purser about how I chose to see this lousy movie, and I was wondering why I made that choice, and I was complaining about how I wasted 2 hours of my life going to see this movie. And then my teacher said, no, you don't understand. You've been practicing forgiveness, and the reason that you chose that movie was because it got out at a different time than the other movie. And if you had not chosen the movie that you did and chose the other one instead, you would have gotten out at a different time, and as a result of that, you would have been driving home and you would have gotten into a bad car accident, and you would have been seriously injured. And I said, oh, you're kidding. And Arden said, no, I like to joke, but I don't kid about things like that. And the reason that you didn't choose to be in that car accident was because you no longer needed to learn that particular lesson, that you would have learned in the car accident, because you no longer needed it because you've been practicing forgiveness. And so then what happened, they said, is that you switch dimensions of time, and it's actually possible, believe it or not, for us to wake up and be in a different dimension of time, and all the same people would be there, and we wouldn't even know it. And then what happens is we go on living our lives oblivious to the fact that we've changed dimensions of time, and then the Holy Spirit takes the old dimension of time, where we no longer need to learn these particular lessons anymore, and the Holy Spirit collapses it, and it disappears. And it's really fascinating because time and space are actually disappearing while we're doing this, and we can't see it, so we don't know it, but that's that whole phenomenon of the Holy Spirit collapsing time. It also says in those first 50 miracles principles that the miracle is the only device at your immediate disposal for controlling time. So when we practice the kind of forgiveness, which is the miracle, and that's what the Course means when it talks about the miracle, it's talking about the act of forgiveness. I know there are some Course students who don't know that that's the miracle, is actually forgiving people. But if you do, then you're actually taking your only device and using it that is at your disposal for controlling time. It also says the miracle minimizes the need for time. Going on to the next section, it says, in the longitudinal or horizontal plane, the recognition of the equality of the members of the sonship appears to involve almost endless time. However, the miracle entails a sudden shift from horizontal to vertical perception. This introduces an interval from which the giver and receiver both emerge farther along in time than they would otherwise have been. The miracle thus has the unique property of abolishing time to the extent that it renders the interval of time it spans unnecessary. There is no relationship between the time a miracle takes and the time it covers. The miracle substitutes for learning that might have taken thousands of years. It does so by the underlying recognition of perfect equality of giver and receiver on which the miracle rests. The miracle shortens time by collapsing it, thus eliminating certain intervals within it. It does this, however, within the larger temporal sequence. So the Holy Spirit is able to collapse time for us without people even noticing it, because it's happening in a vertical kind of an access rather than the horizontal or linear way in which we're thinking about it. And then what happens is every time we forgive somebody, both them and you are actually going further along in time, and the end result is going to be either that you're going to be so much further along in time that you've saved countless lifetimes, or maybe you'll even get to the point where you don't even have to come back again once all that unconscious guilt has been healed in the mind, and you're in a position where you don't need to hide from it anymore. By the way, what the sonship is simply all of us. And A Course in Miracles refers to the sonship as all of the seemingly separate sons of God. That includes all women as well as men, male and female. The Course simply tries to keep its language simple in a very complicated situation. And it refers to all of us. And the sonship appears to be separate on this level. So Jesus talks about the sonship as the seemingly separate ones who are actually the Son of God, but they don't know it. And then what happens as separation is undone, then we will go from being the sonship to simply being God's one Son, which is what we really are anyway. So 2,000 years ago, people thought that Jesus was God's only Son, and it turns out that we all are. There was nothing special about Jesus, and that's why he's referring to us as the sonship. And then when we awaken and become one again, there is no more sonship because there is no more separation between us, and we simply return to being Christ, which is God's one Son. And then when you get back to heaven, there is no Christ or Son or anything like that because those are just words. And as we quoted earlier, when we were talking about time in Revelation, there is no difference in heaven between God and everything else. We actually achieve perfect oneness and get to the point where we have the experience of being what we really are. And then there are no more need for words like sonship. There is simply God, and that's all there is. Another interesting aspect of the subject of time is that even though the script is written, which means that it's already determined, it's kind of a multiple choice script. I'll give you an example. Let's say you get to the end of a road and you can only take a right or a left. It's one of those places. It's not an intersection. You have to go right or left. If you choose to go right, then what will happen after you turn right is already determined. It's already been filmed. The film is already in the can. So you take a right, the house is already there. You're not making them up as you go along. The houses are already there. And everything that's going to happen after you take that right-hand turn is already determined. You could also make a left turn. And if you make the left turn, everything that's going to happen after you make the left turn is already determined. So we do have some choice within a multiple choice script as to what's going to happen. But when we make that choice, everything that's going to happen after that is also already determined. So yes, there are different possibilities and different ways that it can play out, but it doesn't really matter because ultimately it's a fixed system. There are only so many possibilities because we know that time is over. Why? Because the Course says that the Holy Spirit looked back from the end of time and saw when it would be the right time for every mind to be released to revelation and eternity. So even if we make a different choice, then it's still determined after that exactly how it's going to play out. So it's kind of tricky. We think that if we go a different way, it's going to have a different outcome. But even that different outcome is already filmed. It's not like anything is happening at random. In fact, nothing ever happens at random. It's all already determined. It's a little more complicated than it would be if it was just all determined and there was only one possibility. So it is a multiple choice script. But at the same time, ultimately, since it's all written, then our focus becomes not so much on the script itself, but on the forgiveness of the script itself. When you do that, then you're switching over to the Holy Spirit script. And the Holy Spirit script is not a different script than the ego script. It's a different way of looking at the ego script. And if you look at it differently, then that changes everything because it starts by changing your experience. And you may not have a choice over what you experience, but you have a complete choice as to how you experience it. So you can experience the same thing two complete different ways. And that will completely change the way that you look at life and the way that you experience life. In connection with time, the Course also makes a very interesting statement about the body. It says at no single instant does the body exist. And that's a very interesting statement because it's saying that if you didn't have a past and a future, you wouldn't have a body. The body does not exist in the present moment. It doesn't exist in the eternal always. It doesn't exist in the endless now. It only exists because we have a past that we feel guilty about, and we have a future that we are fearful of. And so it's kind of like in harmony with the idea in the Course that talks about what the law of forgiveness is. The law of forgiveness is fear binds the world. Forgiveness sets it free. Well, fear exists as a result of this idea of a past that we have to be guilty of, and that creates a future that we are fearful of being punished in. And so the body is kind of like the thought of separation, and it's kind of like stuck in the middle, and only exists because of those things. If you took away those things, and there was no past and future, then there would be no body in the present. It couldn't possibly exist. It's just binded together by this idea of fear. And without time, there is no body. And at no single instant does the body exist means that if you take away that whole concept of time, then you also take away the body, because it can't exist without that whole ego thought system of sin, guilt, and fear. One thing that we want to remember about all this is that the focus is the undoing of the ego. As A Course in Miracles says, salvation is undoing. There are a lot of spiritual teachers, some of whom seem to be identified as Course in Miracles teachers, who teach you that, you should make friends with your ego, or that you should make peace with your ego. And that's not really true. What you want to do is undo the ego. And so the Course will say things about the ego. For example, it says that its attitude ranges from suspiciousness to viciousness. That's the only range that the ego has in there. It'll be suspicious of you, even if you're not bothering it. And if you're actually trying to undo it, it can even get vicious at times. But that's the only way to undo it. Sometimes the ego will try to steady itself. It may try to hurt you. And that's why the Course says, in response to that, it says, do not be afraid of your ego. No matter what it tries to do to you, it's not real. So don't be afraid of your ego. At the end of this next quotation, you'll see where the ego really stands about all this. This is a quote from the text of the Course. It says, loudly, the ego tells you not to look inward, for if you do, your eyes will light on sin, and God will strike you blind. Then it goes on to say, beneath your fear to look within, because of sin, is yet another fear, and one which makes the ego tremble. What if you looked within and saw no sin? This fearful question is one the ego never asks. And you who ask it now are threatening the ego's whole defensive system too seriously for it to bother to pretend it is your friend. So don't think that the ego is ever going to pretend to be your friend if you're doing this. On the other hand, if you want to be friends with your ego and make peace with it, then you'll just keep it there. So the choice is up to you. You can make friends with your ego and stay stuck in the ego forever, or you can undo the ego and its attitude will be that it is not your friend. And that's the way that it is. My choice is to not worry about making the ego my friend or making peace with it. My choice is to undo it. And in so doing, I know that the ego will not be my friend, but at some point when the ego has been sufficiently undone, then its power would have been diminished to the point where it will get to the way that the Course describes it. It describes, as you undo the ego, its withering attacks is the way that the Course describes it, because the ego is losing power. And it doesn't matter that the ego is not your friend and that it doesn't like you anymore, because it doesn't have the power over you that it used to have. And that's real undoing. That's real examples of getting to the point where you're no longer under the domination of the ego, and the Holy Spirit has started to dominate the mind and take over the mind. I think it's helpful to remember when things get complicated that there are always just two choices, and only one of them is real. The Course says here in the Manual for Teachers, to teach is to demonstrate. There are only two thought systems, and you demonstrate that you believe one or the other is true all the time. From your demonstration, others learn, and so do you. The question is not whether you will teach, for in that there is no choice. The purpose of the Course might be said to provide you with a means of choosing what you want to teach on the basis of what you want to learn. It goes on to say this is inevitable. There is no escape from it. How could it be otherwise? Everyone who follows the world's curriculum, and everyone here does follow it until he changes his mind, teaches solely to convince himself that he is what he is not. Herein is the purpose of the world. What else, then, would its curriculum be? Into this hopeless and closed learning situation, which teaches nothing but despair and death, God sends his teachers. And as they teach his lessons of joy and hope, their learning finally becomes complete. Except for God's teachers, there would be little hope of salvation, for the world of sin would seem forever real. The self-deceiving must deceive, for they must teach deception. And what else is hell? This is a manual for the teachers of God. They are not perfect, or they would not be here. Yet it is their mission to become perfect love. And so they teach perfection over and over in many, many ways until they have learned it. And then they are seen no more. Although their thoughts remain a source of strength and truth forever. Who are they? How are they chosen? What do they do? How can they work out their own salvation and the salvation of the world? This manual attempts to answer those questions, and you could say that A Course in Miracles attempts to answer those questions, and I think it does over the course of its 1,300 pages. And one of the great things that's happened for me since the book The Disappearance of the Universe came out is that people have read The Disappearance of the Universe, even people who have been studying A Course in Miracles for like 20, 25 years. And I hear from them, and they say that they read the book, and then it's like somebody turned the light on. You know, they go back and they read A Course in Miracles, and it makes so much more sense to them, and it's so much more clear to them. It's just amazing. And I'm very clear that I could not have done that. You know, I never read A Course in Miracles until I was introduced to it in the very beginning of 1993. Art and Purser appeared to me at the end of 1992, and then about a week later they came back, and towards the end of their second visit they told me that I was going to start studying A Course in Miracles. You know, and my attitude was, well, nobody's going to tell me what to do. Who they think they are is thinking that they know my future and everything. And of course they did know my future and everything, but I was resistant to the whole thing that was going on because it was a little strange. And they told me after the second visit, at the end of the second visit, I was going to start studying this thing. And sure enough, 3 days later, I was on my way home from this bargain matinee movie, and there was this bookstore that isn't there anymore, but it used to be there, or at least it appeared to be there, in Auburn, Maine. And the bookstore was called Holistic Books and Treasures. And I remember going in there and buying a copy of the Course, and there was this nice lady who was in there who loved to talk a lot. And I saw the blue book there as soon as I went in there, and I brought it up. And she said, oh, yeah, I haven't had any of those in here for months. You know, this just came in this morning. And so that's another one of those synchronicities that I love. And I did start studying the Course. And when I first started studying it and reading it, it might as well have been written in a foreign language. It made no sense to me at all. And I'm very clear that if I didn't have Arten and Persa to clarify it for me and to point me in the right direction, then I never would have really understood what it said. I may have thought that I understood what it said. Being someone who used to read the Bible a long time ago, I probably would have seen it as being kind of like a continuation of the New Testament. But this is not a continuation of the New Testament. This is not Christianity. Some people have called Course in Miracles the Third Testament. And believe me, it is not that. It's so radical and so different than Christianity, it should not be confused with that, and it really has absolutely nothing to do with it. I think that the service that Arten and Persa have provided is that they put it in English. You know, they took this very difficult to understand thing, and they put it in a way that everybody could accept and understand. And you may ask, well, you know, why would that be necessary? Why would that have to happen? Why didn't Jesus himself just put it in English and have it very clear and have everything easy to understand? And I think that there are several good reasons for that. Course in Miracles quotes over 800 times from the King James Version of the Bible. Helen Schuckman was definitely an intellectual, a very advanced person of intellect who was also a PhD and a modern psychologist. And she loved Shakespeare, and she knew the Bible. And what Jesus did was give a certain form of teaching that gave the thought system of the Holy Spirit and corrected all the mistakes that Christianity had made in his name, and he got to do that just fine. Now, there is a school of thought that will tell you that the reason that Jesus did that was because if you give an intellectual something simple, then they won't listen. If you give them something that is simple and makes sense and is nice and clear, they won't respect it. Why? Because they're intellectuals, and so they want it to be complicated. They want it to have all kinds of amazing, interesting things going on behind it. So Jesus gives this 1,300-page treatise that is A Course in Miracles. And one of the reasons it's 1,300 pages is because the truth may be simple, but the ego is not, and the ego has to be undone in layers. And everybody, no matter how complicated the ego is, everybody is going to see things in A Course in Miracles that ring true for them and help to undo the ego. But it's given this way so that it will be impressive to the intellectuals who would never listen to something like this, who would never want to have anything to do with love and forgiveness and all this, because they're just analytical and they're into the complications of the world and being a part of that. The course was given in New York City, the epitome of complexity. So we shouldn't think that we should be going off on a desert island to seek peace. It's like A Course in Miracles wasn't given on a mountaintop in Tibet. It was given in one of the most complicated cities in the world. And it was almost done that way as a statement, as if to say, look, this is where salvation is. This is what you need to forgive. If you can forgive this, then you can be free. This is the fastest way home. It's not in getting out of here and getting away from people and finding peace and quiet like I tried to find in Maine. It's about meeting the ego wherever it is and forgiving it. Actually, the way that the Course came into being was that Helen Schucman, who was a research psychologist at the Columbia College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York City, I think actually the Columbia Presbyterian College of Physicians and Surgeons in New York City, and I got to drive by there first time I did a workshop in Manhattan. John Mundy was kind enough to drive me by there. I'll tell you a quick story about John Mundy, who was the one who brought me into Manhattan to do a workshop, and he was very instrumental in changing my mind about speaking in public. He's kind of like a mentor of mine, and he knew Helen Schucman and was a good friend of hers going back to 1975. And John, after he drove me into the workshop and we did the workshop, we were driving back to his house in the Hudson Valley from Manhattan, and we got onto the turnpike, and we're driving back up there, and we were in the center lane, and all of a sudden, the transmission in John's SUV completely blew. We had people passing us on either side, and it was really all that we could do to get over to the side of the road without getting killed. And after we get over there, I look over at John, and he is like completely peaceful. It's like just this look of peace about him, like nothing's happened. And I'm thinking, Jesus Christ, this guy really believes this stuff. Because he's been practicing it since 1975. He had been doing it for almost 30 years at that time. He's so used to practicing this forgiveness that he knows what everything is for. And as soon as it happens, he just does it automatically. And because of that, he's kind of like in that condition where no matter what the world throws at him and no matter what happens, and the world has thrown a lot at him, he's ready to forgive it. And that's what we're all going to be like eventually. It'll be like no matter what happens in this world, we'll be ready for it and we'll be prepared to forgive it. And once you get to that point, then you're just about all the way home. And as far as Helen Schucman was concerned, Helen was not a peaceful person at all. She was a very conflicted person, and she was in a very tough environment, that College of Physicians and Surgeons. It was highly competitive, highly intellectual, analytical, difficult situation where both her and her colleague, Bill Thetford, have reported that interpersonal relationships were depressingly bad, is the way that she put it. Her colleague's name was Bill Thetford. And they were really the catalyst for A Course in Miracles coming. Helen and Bill worked together. He was her supervisor and superior. And they did not get along with each other at all. And most of the people at this place did not get along with each other at all. And one day, Bill called Helen into his office. and, gave this whole monologue to her about how things have got to change and how, the way he put it, there's got to be a better way, or there's got to be another way. And he was seeking to bring peace to the situation and find a better way for them to live together and work together so that you wouldn't have all of this conflict going on there and all this depression and all this competition. And I think Bill almost expected Helen to laugh at him, but for some reason what Helen said was, Bill, you're right. You're absolutely right, and I will help you find that better way. And then eventually what happened was Helen started to have all kinds of mystical type experiences. The end result of the process of her having these experiences was that she started to hear what she described as the voice, and she wrote it with a capital V. And that was the voice of Jesus that she heard, which eventually resulted in the scribing of A Course in Miracles. So it was really their decision, just like all things, it was really in their decision to find a better way that A Course in Miracles came about. And of course it happened over a period of 7 years and ended up being this 1,300-page spiritual document, which is 3 books in one. It has the text, which is the theory, it has the workbook, which is the actual practice, and it has the manual for teachers, which is kind of like a guide to just taking the course and living it in your life. Teaching A Course in Miracles, in most cases, will not involve getting up and standing in front of a group of people and teaching the course. What the course means by teaching is practicing forgiveness. And that's always what the course is about. And remember, it's always done at the level of the mind. One of my favorite sections in the book, The Disappearance of the Universe, is the chapter called The Holy Spirit's Alternative, because it really sets forth the attitude of the Holy Spirit, which is the attitude that we want to have. Because they say, if you walk like Jesus, if you walk with Jesus, or you walk with the Holy Spirit, then it means that you think like them. That's what it's all about, is thinking like them. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to read the Holy Spirit's attitude towards what we think we've done. Because we all have things that we think that we've done in our life. We all have things that maybe we're not too proud of. This is the way that the Holy Spirit thinks about that. And if this is the way that the Holy Spirit thinks about it, then this is the way that we should think about it. And it's really rather beautiful. At one point, my teachers were talking to me, and Persis said, "You've accused and convicted yourself. But now think of the Holy Spirit as being like a higher court, as the Course describes with these great words." And this is Jesus, and he's talking about the Holy Spirit. He says, "You need not fear the higher court will condemn you. It will merely dismiss the case against you. There can be no case against a child of God, and every witness to guilt in God's creations is bearing false witness to God himself. Appeal everything you believe gladly to God's own higher court, because it speaks for him, and therefore speaks truly. It will dismiss the case against you, however carefully you have built it up. The case may be foolproof, but it is not God-proof. The Holy Spirit will not hear it, because he only witnesses truly. His verdict will always be, 'Thine is the kingdom,' because he was given to you to remind you of what you are." I love that. I think it's really beautiful because, no matter what you think you've done, the Holy Spirit will just throw the case out of court and dismiss it because of what you really are. There's another quote in that same section where it really brings home the idea of the world being like a dream. Persa is talking about this famous quote from the Course, which I'll read now. First, I'll give you the quote. It says, "There is no world. This is the central thought the Course attempts to teach. Not everyone is ready to accept it, and each one must go as far as he can let himself be led along the road to truth. He will return and go still farther, or perhaps step back a while and then return again. But healing is the gift of those who are prepared to learn there is no world, and can accept the lesson now. Their readiness will bring the lesson to them in some form which they can understand and recognize." And of course, the form that we can accept and recognize is the way that it's put in A Course in Miracles. Then Persa goes on to say, if the Course is saying there is no world, then there are not really any people out there who are smarter or more gifted than you. There are not really any people out there who are richer than you, or any who are more famous than you, or getting more sex than you, or doing whatever is necessary to make you feel angry, inferior, or guilty. There's not really anyone coming after you for whatever reason. There's no world for you to conquer, like adults playing King of the Mountain, trying to push each other off the top, which is merely symbolic of the ego trying to overthrow God. There are no problems or threats that can harm what you really are in any way. It's only a dream, and it's actually possible for you to have the kind of peace of mind and lack of fear that would accompany the conviction of that truth. As Jay asks you so pointedly in the text, it says, what if you recognized this world is an hallucination? What if you really understood you made it up? What if you realized that those who seem to walk about in it, to sin and die and attack and murder and destroy themselves, are wholly unreal? The Holy Spirit knows that the images you see are just that, images and nothing more. By taking Him as your teacher, you can learn to experience this through the power of His forgiveness, which is your power, when you join with Him and think like Him. That forgiveness, which the Course describes as right-mindedness, leads back to one-mindedness. And it has to work. You couldn't screw it up if you tried. I know, because I've tried. And the way it works is this. The Course says, salvation is nothing more than right-mindedness, which is not the one-mindedness of the Holy Spirit, but which must be achieved before one-mindedness is restored. Right-mindedness leads to the next step automatically, because right perception is uniformly without attack, and therefore wrong-mindedness is obliterated. The ego cannot survive without judgment, and is laid aside accordingly. The mind then has only one direction in which it can move. Its direction is always automatic, because it cannot but be dictated by the thought system to which it adheres. So what's that saying is that if you do this, if you practice forgiveness, if you practice right-mindedness, then eventually that must lead you back to one-mindedness, which is oneness, which is the idea that God is, and you actually return to what you really are, which is perfectly one. It's like the ego is being undone. You're going from a condition of being divided and separate back to a condition of being whole and one and complete. And eventually, not only will that be your experience, but when you lay the body aside for the last time, then that is actually the last time that you'll ever have to come back here, because there's no more of that unconscious guilt in the mind. The experience of enlightenment is not something that can really be put into words any more than the experience of revelation and what it's like to be with God can be put into words, simply because it's a whole experience. It's a whole picture where here we are divided. St. Paul was right about something when he said, we see now only in part, but then we shall be whole. And of course the word holy comes from the word whole. So we see now only in part, but then we shall be whole. The final experience will be a condition of wholeness and oneness. And that's a great experience. It can't be put into words, but it's no longer divided and it's no longer separate. Resurrection is something that under the thought system of A Course in Miracles does not happen to the body. It did play itself out symbolically with Jesus 2,000 years ago, because he did appear to the disciples after his body had been murdered. But what that is the love of Jesus returning in a form that the disciples could accept and understand. What is really resurrected at the time that we no longer have to come back here is the mind. A Course in Miracles at one point says this is the only thing that can be saved. You cannot take a body into heaven with you because it is not a thought of separation. It is not a thought of form. It is the thought of perfect oneness, which is abstract and which is whole and unified. The body, being the thought of separation, is laid aside forever, and you don't need one anymore. And what remains is the mind, and then the mind is returned to its condition of spirit. At one point, very early in the Course, it says mind is the activating agent of spirit. So by using the mind to choose spirit instead of separation, that reactivates spirit. And then when all the lessons have been learned and the unconscious guilt is gone and the mind is returned to a condition of oneness and wholeness, then the mind is resurrected and it becomes spirit again. And the seemingly separated mind disappears and you become all of creation. You become one with all of it. So you're no longer separate, and that finite separated mind is just kind of laid aside and the ego disappears and you become one with everything. This results in a state of immortality, which is what it's really all about. And immortality, as the Course teaches, is a constant state. It's something that does not involve time, and so it's something that always was. And what we do is we reawaken to that and find out that we were always immortal. And actually, that's why the next book that I'm writing, which is going to come out in 2006, is called Your Immortal Reality. And the subtitle is How to Break the Cycle of Birth and Death. And it's about achieving that immortality and how to go about it. Your immortal reality is just that, your reality. Anything else aside from that is not real and is not what we really are. It's very interesting the way that second book happened because I didn't see Arten and Persa for 2 years. They appeared to me 17 times from the end of 1992 to the end of 2001, and they didn't really tell me if they were ever going to come back again, so I didn't know for about 2 years if I would ever see them again, and I was pretty busy those 2 years, and my life was being turned upside down, and it was the end of 2003, and I remember I was at my friend Vicky Poppy's house in Massachusetts, and I went there for a Christmas party. It was a Saturday night, and then the next day was a Sunday afternoon, and I was getting ready to drive back to Maine. And I said to Vicky, I got a feeling something's going to happen here. And she said, yeah, I know what you mean. I feel it too. And it happened to be December the 21st, which those of you who have read the book will know is the feast day for St. Thomas. And I drove back to Maine that afternoon. And that night, I was sitting there in my living room, and this was in the apartment that we moved to after most of the visits the first time had already been over. I think the last 3 visits by Arten and Persa in that first series of visits were done at this apartment in Auburn, Maine. And I was sitting there, and I was pointed toward the TV, and the couch that they used to appear on was to my left and behind me and also pointed toward the TV. And all of a sudden, I felt a presence in the room. And I felt them, and I looked to my left, and there were Arten and Persa sitting on that couch for the first time in 2 years. And I was so excited, I ran over to them, and I hugged them. And I was just so happy to see them. And I remembered later, actually, that was the first time I ever touched Arten. I had touched Persa once before, but I never touched Arten. And I hugged both of them, and it was just so great to see them. And they explained to me many things, and one of them was that they wanted to come back and do a second book because they want to help keep people focused on what this is all about and doing the kind of forgiveness that is taught in A Course in Miracles and the Disappearance of the Universe. And I think part of the reason they want to do that is because there's so many different things out there that people have a tendency to jump around a lot. They try so many different things. And I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. Indeed, it's helpful for us to have a good background to draw on because that's how we learn what we need to learn so that eventually when we do get into the phase of application, we can actually apply everything that we've learned. But the way Arten and Persa described it, a lot of people are staying stuck in what they called in the first book the spiritual buffet line. It's like they jump from thing to thing, try so many different things, but that's not what really leads to the best progress. What leads to the best progress is if you find a good spirituality and stick with it and apply it in your everyday life. And a good spiritual training system like Buddhism or A Course in Miracles, if you take that and you stick with it and you learn all you can from it and actually apply it in your everyday life all the time over a period of many years, that is the best way to make substantial spiritual progress in this lifetime. And so I think the reason they came back and gave this material was to keep people focused on doing this, to kind of like tap people on the shoulder and remind them, look, this is the fastest way to break the cycle of birth and death. This is the end of reincarnation and the way to experience your immortal reality. And if you keep doing this and stay focused on this kind of forgiveness, then you will achieve the result that you're trying to achieve. And so it was really great. And Art and Purser appeared to me 11 times from the end of 2003 well into 2005, into the late summer. And they gave me all this material, which really brings home all this stuff about forgiveness and how to do it and adds a lot of material. And so I was very happy to have it because it helped me. And they appeared to me at a time when I was really just beginning to speak in public. I had no intention of doing that, and I explained how my mind got changed about that. And they really came to help me too. And I'm very, very grateful to them. And I'm very grateful to you people and all of your support that you've given me. I never expected to get so much love and so much encouragement in this whole thing. I guess that I didn't realize how good it could be. And I'm deeply grateful. I want to let you know that I have a lot of joy about this whole thing and the way that it's happening. You know, the book is being translated into about 14 different languages and spreading all over the world. I'm just so happy about that. And in fact, joy is one of the characteristics of a teacher of God, the way that it's described in the Manual for Teachers in the course. And I'd like to elaborate on that just a little bit by actually telling you what the course says about that and also giving you my own take on it. It says here that joy is the inevitable result of gentleness. Gentleness means that fear is now impossible. And what could come to interfere with joy? The open hands of gentleness are always filled. The gentle have no pain. They cannot suffer. Why would they not be joyous? They are sure they are beloved and must be safe. Joy goes with gentleness as surely as grief attends attack. God's teachers trust in him, and they are sure his teacher goes before them, making sure no harm can come to them. They hold his gifts and follow in his way, because God's voice directs them in all things. Joy is their song of thanks, and Christ looks down on them in thanks as well. His need of them is just as great as theirs of him. How joyous it is to share the purpose of salvation. You know, and I think it's very interesting there, the way that joy and gratitude are so closely related. It says joy is their song of thanks, and Christ looks down on them in thanks as well. What a great attitude to have, to be grateful. If you're grateful, then not only are you in a great state of mind, but you're kind of like almost praying in a positive way for good things. If you're in a state of gratitude, then it's like creating all kinds of wonderful things in your mind. It doesn't really matter how it shows up on the surface, and that paragraph that I just read is not to be taken at the level of form. This is about what we really are. The reason that we're not fearful is because we know what we really are, which is immortal, it's invulnerable, it's something that can't be threatened in any way by this world. And when you know that you can't be touched by anything in the world and that you can't be harmed, at least not the real you, and the body is insignificant, then that definitely leads to a place of joy. You know, how could you not be joyful, knowing that you're something that is invulnerable and can't really be hurt? So it's a great condition to be in. You know, at one point, A Course in Miracles asks, do you prefer that you be right or happy? Well, I think that a lot of us say that we would rather be happy, but then we go ahead and live our lives as though we'd rather be right. And what the Course is asking us to do is forgive and to realize that we weren't right, that the Holy Spirit is right, and that what we made is not true, and that what God made is eternal. And we make that choice really every time that we choose forgiveness. You know, we talk about things like enlightenment and resurrection and immortality, and sometimes the mind will say, oh, well, you know, that's for some great saint or some great sage, but it's not for me. And the truth is, it's for everybody. And as we go through life practicing this kind of forgiveness and the ego is undone, then what happens is that we start to suspect that, yeah, maybe I can do this. You know, maybe I am innocent. You know, if you can get in touch with your innocence, it's such a great experience that you start to realize that maybe heaven is for you, and maybe that's where you really do belong. And you start to feel like there's not really any difference between somebody like me and Buddha and Jesus. because they just want to be my friends. They just want to lead by example and have me end up being the same way as them. So this really is for me. It's not just for the saints in the sages. They're no different than me. They just were a little bit ahead of me in time. But since time is an illusion, then that doesn't really mean anything, does it? So we're all going to wake up. And what happens is when you wake up from a dream of time and space, there is no more time and space. Just like when you wake up from a dream that you had in bed last night, where is the dream? The dream disappears. It's gone because it never really existed in the first place. That's what will happen to the universe. It will disappear, and you awaken to what you really are. And when you awaken from a dream of time and space, everybody is already there, because the world that you thought was there is there no longer. And everybody is one, and we left as one, and we will return as one. And we've already been having a great experience before we even get to that point, because once you get in touch with your innocence, it brings about all kinds of marvelous experiences. And it's a path that is well worth walking on, because it results in experience. And experience is the only thing that will ever really make us happy, not just an idea of what we are, but an actual experience of what we really are. To close up this program, I'd like to read a little bit from a great workbook lesson in A Course in Miracles that's one of my favorites. It's called, I Will Be Still an Instant and Go Home. And part of it is about how there's this little child inside of us, and how as we go through life practicing this kind of forgiveness, that little child is transformed back to the child of God. It may start off as being seemingly separate, and that's why at first this workbook lesson spells the word child with a small c, but later on it spells it with a large C, because that little child is becoming what it really is, which is the child of God in its experience. We're already that, but it's out of our awareness, and we're not experiencing it, and we will all get to the point where we do experience it, and this is kind of like what comes about as that happens. We speak today for everyone who walks this world, for he is not at home. He goes uncertainly about in endless search, seeking in darkness what he cannot find, not recognizing what it is he seeks. 1,000 homes he makes, yet none contents his restless mind. He does not understand he builds in vain. The home he seeks cannot be made by him. There is no substitute for heaven. All he ever made was hell. Perhaps you think it is your childhood home that you would find again. The childhood of your body and its place of shelter are a memory now so distorted that you can merely hold a picture of a past that never happened. Yet there is a child in you who seeks his father's house and knows that he is alien here. This childhood is eternal, with an innocence that will endure forever. This child is your defenselessness, your strength. He trusts in you. He came because he knew you would not fail. He whispers of his home unceasingly to you, for he would bring you back with him, that he himself might stay and not return again where he does not belong, and where he lives an outcast in a world of alien thoughts. His patience has no limits. He will wait until you hear his gentle voice within you, calling you to let him go in peace, along with you, to where he is at home, and you with him. You have not lost your innocence. It is for this you yearn. This is your heart's desire. This is the voice you hear, and this the call which cannot be denied. The Holy Child remains with you. His home is yours. Today he gives you his defenselessness, and you accept it in exchange for all the toys of battle you have made. And now the way is open, and the journey has an end in sight at last. Be still an instant, and go home with him, and be at peace a while.
This concludes The Secrets of the Immortal with Gary Renard. Music by Stephen McNamara. Thank you for listening.
Audible hopes you have enjoyed this program.